So we are live. Good morning, good afternoon, and actually good evening for us. Um, Thank you for joining us on this CTF reveal. We're gonna discuss one of the most attempted CTFs we had so far. Almost 3,000 attempts, and out of that, I think like 29 people solved it, which is actually impressive. And this is a nice one. A lot of things to learn from this. So let's just get started. Itzik, why don't you start explaining first of
Yeah,
all? Yeah, what's going
what's
on
the
here?
intention, right?
Yeah,
What,
what's the
what what's
intention?
the
Like, what is this code doing briefly, and then we
right?
can go in and try to figure out what the
Yeah,
security issues with this code.
sounds good. So a very classic, pretty classic API endpoint, which with the goal of actually fetching from a database of movies information, fetching information based on a query. So you can query by fields and so forth. This is a MongoDB NoSQL database, an example that exists out there from the Atlas project, where it's already populated with a bunch of videos. I just plugged into this video library, and just an API that looks pretty naive, that queries the database and does it pretty well. So what we're seeing here from a code
So
perspective.
before we go in, can you show like the intended way to like make this work? Just show in the
Absolutely.
when you scroll down, you kind of think you can show.
Yeah, absolutely. So we won't see the response because I'm using the actual CTF shell. But for example, what you could do here is you can query the database, use the year field, and put the value of 1955, and ask for 10 items max or something like that. You can also have here, a field for message. We'll talk about this field, which says when you don't have any items, um, you can put any message you want. Okay, so that's the intended functionality, the simple one. If I hit hack here, what will happen is it goes to the database, queries the database, MongoDB query. It's already the query, and in this case, couldn't find any items for 1955, the year. Okay, but
Okay.
if I do 2000, for example, I bet there should be. Oh, no items.
Okay, never
Interesting.
mind. But this is sort of the
Never mind. Yeah.
intended.
Oh,
This is
sorry.
the intended way.
I think that's the problem. I quoted the year. Quoted the year. So this should be here. Oops. Oh, nope.
We
Yeah.
have.
Anyway, that's the intended behavior. I'm not sure what I've done wrong here, but oh yeah. Sorry. Another
There.
comma here. Okay.
So this is the intended way.
Yep. Here you can see that multiple objects came back. In this case, 10, because I limited to 10. The year 2000, queries the database. If you do it using, for example, Postman or any other tool that runs API directly, you will see the actual objects. They include information about the movie. So that's the
Cool.
intended behavior. Yep.
Okay, so let's go back to the code and see.
Yep.
It's pretty short. Let's go
Exactly.
quickly through it and
Let's go
and
quickly and explain what the developers had in mind. Like, they wanted to create, obviously, the most flexible API to provide access to any query you might want to do, even complicated queries like you can do $in for MongoDB and other things. So to do that, no items message, not necessarily necessary always, but if you want to translate it to different languages, when there are no items and you want to say it in German or other language, you can change that. Um, then here we unserialize the body, which is unnecessary. But the developer point of view here was, I want to capture any type of JSON, even very complicated ones with all sorts of sub, JSONs and all the different characters. So I'm going to use a library that is strong, and found this library, which is called Node Serialize, imported here. And we're importing it and using the data and actually deserializing it or unserializing it. That's, by the way, the main vulnerability, and we'll talk about it. But then, very simple code that actually takes the query, plugs it in here, assigns the no item message from the data message and number of items from items so that we can use them later. Okay. No sanitization here as well, because there was no harm from a point of view of the developer. And then, getting the database, unserializing the query because the query is not deserializes automatically, and then running the database collection find method with even sorting, okay, and limiting the number of items, as you can see here, to 20 if there's no limit, or if someone limited it, use the number if it's a number, is NaN is if it's a number, and then limiting the amount of time that it takes the query and to array. That's it. Then everything is returned by using JSON stringify of the movies. So you get a string of the JSON of everything. Pretty simple code, nothing too crazy. And if there are no items here, movies.length equals 0, we return no items message.
Cool. So now, so like you said, it's a very simple code, but soon we will find out how a single line here can give an attacker, basically they can take over the account, right?
Exactly. So apparently this library, when you install it, you get the warning, but people can miss that. You should notice that. It's a very serious vulnerability, because what it does is it allows, you see it in blue right now?
Yeah, it's yeah, you need to click again. It's all selected, I think, or something.
It doesn't work. Let me do that. Sorry, I'll refresh that. Sorry about that. Okay. And so that library, when you install it, actually tells you, this library here, node serialize at the top, is actually showing a vulnerability. It's a pretty serious one. It means that the unserialized is actually parsing functions. And when it parses functions, it reads them as functions and can be even executed in the event of unserialized. So what ends up happening, if you use it properly as intended, you can actually run functions by just using the serialized unserialized of the SQL of the JSON.
So let's see this in action. Do you want to show this, and then
yeah, I can show that in action. Okay, so I'm going to write a function. If I read the manual of this library, which the vulnerability is stated there, okay, in the message, which returns to me, I want to get something from it, I'm going to actually run a function. In this case, this function is going to require fs, then it's going to read file. I'm going to find where the file that I want to read is in. I can read a system file or some secret file in this case, and then return the text. And very important, I can actually run the method. If I just insert it, I have a method, but it's not executed. If I use the parentheses here at the end, it actually runs it. Okay, and this one is not important, but when I run it this way, I'm going to get the flag, because this is actually going to read the secret key, and it's going to take me to sorry, what happened here? I think our service is down.
This is running on the server or on the client?
This is running on the server. So this method, this function, actually executes on the server. It's a remote code execution. So it means that when this Node.js command, data equals serialize unserialized request body, is actually executed, what ends up happening is this is being executed. Okay, this code is being executed.
And this is just an example. This is just an example of a function. For this challenge, we said let's read from secret.js, but it could be basically any function. So you're basically getting here command line almost level to the server just because of a single line that looks harmless at the beginning.
Exactly. It's what's happening here. When you run this code, okay, what ends up happening, the deserialized, the unserialized function runs eval. And let's see that. Actually, in the library itself, there's an eval command, which you can see here. There's an eval command if you go to the source code of this library, node serialize, and it actually runs the function, okay? And when it runs the function, this is executed. And specifically in this one, the result of the function is returned in the message. Okay?
So you're getting like input and output. You can
Exactly.
basically you can run a command, take an SSH key or anything that you can find there, passwords, basically anything. You have command line. You can potentially build a whole command and control using this.
Exactly. Exactly. It's a remote code execution. It's a very serious vulnerability, which means that someone can take over the entire server and do whatever they want on the server. So the problem is huge, and very straightforward kind of like takeaway is figure out which libraries you're using and make sure that they don't have vulnerabilities such as this one, because this is very serious, can really
Now,
take over the entire.
is this a vulnerability? Because this is intended to work like this, right? This
Yes.
library is risky. It's not like something that needs to be patched. This
Yeah.
is, even if you take the
Totally.
latest library, it's
Totally.
still.
So that's you're right. So this is not this was identified as a vulnerability if you use it incorrectly. In this case, it was used incorrectly because it was used on user input without any sanitization or any control. What ends up happening is that anyone can actually run code on the server. But this is intended behavior because this function was intended to be parsed by this library. So if you use it internally between your data and within the system without having any user input in this, then this is fine. It's fine. It works as expected. So the vulnerability is not because the library is flawed. It's because that's what the library does, and you need to understand how to use it. Definitely not when user input is involved, and actually kind of like expose it to what we're just showing here, which is actual remote code execution of any kind.
So this, I think, is an important takeaway, because it's, we think about always making sure we have the latest version, sort of, patch the library, make sure you're using the right one. But this shows that even when you use good libraries, that you're using them internally, if people don't really understand what the libraries do and how they were intended to work, they can create huge risks and open up backdoors into the company, into the code. So people need to not just take the libraries as is, they need to read the documentation or understand or look for any type of exploits that could potentially be included in those libraries before using them. Don't just like blindly take something and use it just because it worked internally.
Absolutely, absolutely. And that's something I typically say. You need to understand what you need and what you want, and what's the limitation of a library. If that's considered a limitation, just don't use it on user input. As long as you use it between your data and your system, no problem. As long as there's no user input involved that can mess around with it. And if you want to use it with user input, and there's a certain behavior that you want to preserve, you definitely need to sanitize and make sure that things that you don't want to have in are not passed. And it's always better to use, allow access than deny access, or deny list, allow list and deny list, where you start with not allowing anything and you open up whatever you need, versus you start with everything allowed and start blocking, because you will always forget things that could be a bypass and could be a different way to specify something and still hack.
Cool. So let's go up. So we discussed this a little bit earlier, and last week, 2 weeks ago actually, when we did the reveal of CTF3, there
Mhm.
was a vulnerability where we just blindly copied everything from one object to another, right?
Exactly.
And
Yep.
what I actually like about this code specifically, I'm just pointing this out because we're looking at ways to keep, to write secure code. Even though there are all those, this big vulnerability, you can see that we explicitly took the fields from the object and we didn't just clone it into the data object, because we could have just,
Right.
assign everything inside. So the
Yep.
fact that we are explicitly taking items and messages and all of that is a good practice. However, potentially we would have wanted to sanitize them before assigning them, even though maybe it's not a risk in this case. But it's just the best practices, building those guardrails.
Yep.
as
Yep.
not thinking too much. Let's, just building guardrails for yourself.
Here's an example. Here's an example. Like I think what you said makes a ton of sense because you see we're using data message here. Okay, no items message. In this case, the message is there's some UI presenting it, right? And if the UI is doing that with inner HTML, the message with regardless of the RCE, you can inject into the message something that injects the cookies. Oh, sorry, hijacks the cookies by using XSS, for example, right?
Mhm.
Or if it's stored somewhere, we can maybe use it later and so forth. So it's always recommended. In this case, it's again not the best practice to just copy the field as is without sanitizing it. I would make sure that the message at least doesn't include any malicious HTML or JavaScript. For example, you can use don't purify here to purify the message. Is that enough? Probably not, because the UI needs to, as we've seen in previous examples, needs to probably also take the entire element and DOM purify it. But as a very basic practice, I would DOM purify at least the message to make sure that it's not going anywhere and doing harm, because
Mhm.
this ends up being in a UI somewhere. So if it's in UI, there's a lot of chance that someone is using inner HTML or something like that. And if you're not careful, it could be harmful.
So if we dive into the mindset of an attacker, right? The few things that they would, because they don't have the code like we do, right? Like this challenge shows you the code and they don't have the code. So you may ask yourself, okay, so how do they know how to break this code? So one of the things, two things that I see here that, if I was to attack this is, one, you want to make sure you see that you can impact the output, right? The response. So the fact that I can in the message, because I'm giving in the JSON object the message that will be displayed if there's no items found. So from my perspective, when I see this, it says, okay, I can reflect on the screen, so I can use that maybe to create an XSS. So that's like one thing that I will try to play around with, even without having the ability to see the code, which is sort of what you said just now.
Exactly.
And the
Exactly.
second thing is I would try to run, to take that from a command line execution level, where I will try to run a function inside a JSON. So even if I don't have the code in front of me, just as an attacker, I would assume people may not have, like, I'm guessing, and I'm thinking what developers might do and how they, because they're not security aware, many of them, and I will probably attack those two things: the output
Mhm.
and the ability to put JavaScript into that JSON.
Exactly. Exactly. Yes. So I think maybe we want to review kind of
Yeah.
like the takeaways. Yep. So um, again, we've published, as always, we've published the CTF walkthrough where we're kind of like having the goals here, what is required here, or what are we trying to emphasize, what's the vulnerability. Description of the code, you can see the eval here that exists within the node serialized code of the library. And then there's also a security warning, very clear one in the documentation that states that problem and exactly shows how this works. Okay, so this is an intended behavior. It's not like a vulnerability that is, fixed later in a later version. This is not going to be fixed because that's the intended behavior. You just need to know what you're using it for. In this case, we were using it for the wrong reason, or at least in the wrong place. Okay. And then if we scroll down, that's the code. Okay, we've seen it already. So what's wrong with that approach is, again, notice node serialize, very harmful when using user input. And then a walkthrough of how to actually put together a payload that takes you through and reads secret JS, which we just shown. Okay, so there's no need to go through that. RCE, the reason that we're talking about RCE, very, very dangerous. There's not even, doubt about how harmful this could be. Because if you can run commands on the server, then you pretty much have control. The only thing you can do is this takeaway number 3 here. We'll get to it, where you limit the credentials of the user running the service. Then maybe the harm can be limited, at least, because you're running on his behalf every command, and you won't be able to run very sophisticated things. So that's the third takeaway. So the first takeaway is, again, you install a library, take a look at the third party library vulnerability. Obviously, when you run npm or any package manager, you can get those notifications about vulnerabilities and see if there are versions that fix it. And sometimes it's intended behavior is here. You need to always question whether you can return a message that can be controlled from the input, because a message that is controlled from the user input means that any harmful behavior can return messages, get some data back to a potential attacker, and you need to be on top of it. It's always important to think about the idea that we talked about before, allow list versus deny list, where you allow certain things, okay? And if you need to open up more in the future, you can always open up more, but never start with I allow everything, meaning I can put any message I want. In this case, I want to allow, I don't know, select from 20 types of messages or 20 type of things, but not everything in the world, okay? And then lastly, as I mentioned before, if we limit the permissions of the service that is running in, you might ask, I'm a developer, so that's a DevOps problem. Why do you care? Because the DevOps don't know what's required from the software to be able to do. And if the developers give directions about, oh, this service needs A, B, C access, that's it, all the rest is out of range and out of scope, then DevOps can limit the user and create a user that actually can do only A, B, C, not more. So DevOps, it's their problem or it's their challenge to make sure that users have the bare minimum permissions and credentials. However, developers know what those are. So we need to be involved and we need to give instructions on what we need to do. In this case, I'm running it on Vercel. That's a serverless function. There's absolutely no power to the running user, but for running the code, even not deleting files, because otherwise players in this game could have deleted my files.
Yeah. So I think I love what you said. This last part that you spoke about. I think it shows that this is a security culture goes across the entire company, and we tend to think about who's responsible for security. Well, like you just said, everyone, right? Yes, the security is probably the ones that are handling this, but like you said, if they don't know how the app works or what's needed. So we need, and this is why we're doing this as well, right? Because we want the developers not only to know how to code secure code, we also want them to understand that they need to collaborate with, the DevOps or the DevSecOps or the security, and communication is key. And it all starts with culture. So having that security culture across departments, I think, is key.
Absolutely. So with that, that's pretty much all we had for this summary. We'd love to get feedback from anyone here who's interested in learning more, giving us feedback about challenges, giving us feedback about anything. I guess we'll see you again next time in about 2.5 weeks from now about the next challenge.
And the next challenge is released next week, next Thursday,
August 31st. August is long, so in this case, it's 2.5 weeks.
Okay.
So in August 31st.
Okay, so until then, thank you all for attending, and this is recorded, and please share this with your team. This is a great resource, and this series, I really love it. I get to learn new stuff, and it's just an amazing opportunity for people to learn everything, not everything, but to learn a lot about coding securely. Okay.
Thank you very much.
Have a great weekend.